The general's phone rang before dawn. It was 3:30 in the morning. April 13th, 1984, New Delhi. Lieutenant General P.N. Hoon had been waiting for this call for weeks. Indian intelligence had intercepted something disturbing. A Pakistani firm had placed a large order. High-altitude mountaineering gear. Boots rated to -60. Oxygen systems. Extreme, cold sleeping equipment. Enough for a military expedition, not a civilian one. Hoon gave the order immediately. Operation Meghdut. Move now. Move fast. Get to the glacier before they do. Indian troops were loaded onto helicopters in the pre-dawn darkness and flown to altitudes no military unit had ever permanently occupied. Their boots hit the snow at 20,000 feet above sea level, the cruising altitude of a passenger jet. They had no idea what was waiting for them up there. Nobody did. To understand why two nations have been bleeding on a glacier for over 40 years, you first have to understand what the Siachen Glacier actually is. It sits in the Karakoram Range, the mountain system in the far north of the Indian subcontinent that contains K2, the second highest mountain on Earth and the largest concentration of extreme altitude peaks outside the Himalayas. At the end of a long grinding river of ancient ice, at the heart of that range is the Siachen Glacier, 76 kilometers long, up to 8 kilometers wide. The second largest glacier outside the polar regions, and the highest active battlefield in human history. Let's put that altitude in perspective. Mount Everest Base Camp sits at about 5,364 meters. Thousands of trekkers attempt it every year. Most feel genuinely sick when they get there. Nausea, headaches, insomnia. The body struggling to function in air with 40% less oxygen than at sea level. The Indian and Pakistani military posts on Siachen sit above Everest Base Camp. Some positions push 6,400 meters, less than 2.5 kilometers below the summit of Everest itself. At that altitude, the body doesn't just struggle, it begins to break down permanently. Blood thickens, lungs labor. The brain begins making critical errors under what doctors call chronic hypoxia. Every physical task, carrying a rifle, climbing a ladder, walking across a room, requires enormous conscious effort. And then there is the cold. The temperature on Siachen drops to -60 degrees Celsius, -76 Fahrenheit. At that temperature, exposed skin begins to freeze within 30 seconds. Metal equipment becomes brittle and shatters on impact. Diesel fuel gels solid. Rifle lubricants freeze inside the action. The cold is not an inconvenience up here. It is a weapon, the most efficient weapon on the battlefield. And then the wind. The Karakoram generates sudden storms with zero warning at any time of year. Winds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour arrive in minutes. At that wind speed and that temperature, a soldier caught in the open without shelter will be dead within minutes. Not injured, dead. Now, why does any of this matter strategically? Because Siachen sits at the junction of three nations, India, Pakistan, and China. Whoever holds the high ground of the Saltoro Ridge, the western wall of the glacier, commands sight lines deep into Pakistani territory and directly overlooks the Karakoram Highway, China's most critical land route to Pakistan and the Arabian Sea. Control Siachen, and you hold a strategic observation post that no army in the valley below can neutralize. You own the high ground in the most literal sense imaginable. It's not about the ice. It never was. It's about what the ice overlooks. The war over Siachen was created by a single line on a map that was never drawn. When India and Pakistan agreed to a ceasefire line after their 1971 war, the surveyors reached a point on the map called NJ9842 and stopped. Beyond that point, they wrote the words "thence north to the glaciers" and left the rest blank. The terrain beyond NJ9842 was considered completely uninhabitable. No crops, no roads, no people. Just ice and rock at 5,000 meters. Nobody could live there, nobody could fight there, and nobody could see any reason to draw a line through it. That single cartographic decision, that would eventually cost both nations over $100 billion, thousands of lives, and an ongoing military commitment now, entering its fifth decade. For 10 years, the blank line meant nothing. The glacier was too remote, too dangerous, and too apparently useless for anyone to care. Then came Colonel Narendra Kumar. Colonel Kumar was not a typical soldier. He was one of India's most celebrated high-altitude mountaineers, a man who who had submitted peaks across the Himalayas and the Karakoram. Through the 1970s, he conducted survey expeditions on and around the Siachen Glacier, and what he found alarmed him deeply. International mountaineering permits were being issued by Pakistan for peaks in the area India considered its territory. Foreign expedition teams from Japan, Germany, and the United States were trekking through the Siachen region under Pakistani authorization. Kumar wrote reports, sent warnings up the chain, was largely ignored. Delhi didn't want a confrontation over what civil servants called a pile of uninhabitable ice. Then came the intercepted equipment orders, Pakistani military contacts with mountaineering outfitters, bulk purchases of extreme altitude gear, enough for an army expedition. General Hoon finally had what he needed, and that is why, in the darkness before dawn on April 13th, 1984, the helicopters lifted off. India got there first, by days, possibly by hours. Pakistani equipment was reportedly already en route when Indian soldiers were setting up positions on the Saltoro Ridge. Imagine this. You are 22 years old. You have been rotated to a forward post on the Siachen Glacier. Your post is a hollowed-out cave in the ice at 6,000 meters. It is roughly 4 meters by 4 meters. You will live in this cave with 6 other soldiers for the next 3 months. You will not shower. Water freezes instantly. Your drinking water comes from ice melted over a kerosene heater, and that kerosene was flown in by helicopter at enormous cost and considerable danger. You eat rations designed for extreme cold. You sleep in a bag rated to -50, still wearing 3 layers of thermal clothing, because the heating system sometimes fails without warning in the night. Every time you step outside and plan to move more than a few meters, you wear supplemental oxygen. Your rifle has been specially modified because standard lubricants freeze solid in the action. You have been trained to fire wearing 3 pairs of gloves because removing them for more than 30 seconds risks frostbite to your trigger finger. And you are one of the fortunate ones. You made it to the post. Here is the number that defines the Siachen conflict more than any other statistic, any battle map, any political statement. Since 1984, an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers have died on the Siachen Glacier and the surrounding ridges. The governments classify the exact numbers. Historians argue the precise figures, but the breakdown, the cause of death breakdown, is not seriously disputed by anyone who has studied the conflict. The vast majority of those deaths were not caused by the enemy. They were caused by the glacier. Avalanches, high-altitude pulmonary edema, where the lungs fill with fluid as the body catastrophically fails to adapt to thin air. Frostbite progressing to gangrene, requiring amputations in conditions where surgery itself is barely possible. Crevices, hidden cracks in the glacier ice that open without warning and swallow a man whole. Falls on ice slopes so steep that a single slip means 1,000-foot drop onto bare rock. And the cold. Always, endlessly, the cold. On February 3rd, 2012, a massive avalanche buried a Pakistani army camp at the Gayari sector at the base of the glacier. The camp held 120, 9 soldiers and 11 civilians. They were buried under 80 feet of compacted snow and ice. Rescue operations lasted nearly 6 months. They found 6 bodies. The glacier kept the other 134. 140 people. No shot fired. No bomb dropped. The mountains simply moved the way mountains do. And 140 lives ended in seconds. And both sides stayed. If there is one moment in the Siachen conflict that captures everything, the geography, the madness, the cost, and the extraordinary human will required to survive in that place. It is the story of Captain Bana Singh. June 23, 1987. Pakistani forces had seized and fortified a position on a feature the Indians called Sonam Top at 6,400 meters. From this post, Pakistani snipers and machine gunners dominated a section of the Saltoro Ridge and harassed Indian positions below. The problem with retaking the post was immediately obvious to anyone who looked at a map. It sat at the top of a near vertical ice wall. The entire approach was completely exposed. Pakistani defenders could see any attacker from hundreds of meters away, and there was nowhere, not a single rock, not not a fold in the terrain to take cover. The glacier had stripped the mountain bare. It was, militarily speaking, an impossible objective. Captain Bana Singh was assigned the mission anyway. On the night of June 23rd, he led his team up the ice face in darkness, moving on ropes and ice axes, wearing crampons, carrying full combat loads at an altitude where every breath was a conscious effort. They moved as quietly as 40 kilograms of high-altitude gear allows, which is to say, not quietly at all. They reached the Pakistani position before dawn. In the close quarters fighting that followed on the ice and rock, the Indian team took the post. Captain Bana Singh was awarded the Param Vir Chakra, India's highest military decoration. He was one of only 21 soldiers in Indian history to receive it. The post was renamed Bana Post. India still holds it today. Bana Post sits at 6,400 meters. It is the highest permanently occupied military position in human history. The helicopter rotation flight to reach it is considered one of the most routinely dangerous military aviation missions in the world. Pilots fly at maximum altitude limits in unpredictable winds toward a landing pad on a glacier that shifts position every year as the ice moves. Now let's talk about money, because eventually every conversation about Siachen comes to this. India spends an estimated $4 to $5 million every single day maintaining its forces on the glacier. Not fighting, not advancing, not achieving a tactical objective, simply maintaining the occupation, keeping the post supplied, rotating the troops, flying the helicopters. That is roughly $1.5 billion per year. Pakistan's figures are classified, but independent analysts estimate similar expenditure on their side. The combined annual cost to both nations is likely above $2 billion. Since 1984, the cumulative total conservatively exceeds $100 billion spent on a glacier by two nations where hundreds of millions of people live below the poverty line. Both governments know this. Both governments have sat at the negotiating table in 1986, in 1989, in 1992, in 2006, in 2012, and discussed demilitarizing the glacier. Each time, the talks collapsed at the same point for the same reason. Neither side will agree to authenticate the current troop positions on a formal map, because to formally mark those positions is to give the other side a permanent territorial claim backed by international documentation. India controls the high ground and gains from authentication. Pakistan controls the lower approaches and loses from it. They cannot agree on whose positions to freeze in ink. So instead of signing a paper, they both keep paying $4 million a day, and the glacier takes it. The FUBAR WARS channel exists to ask a single question. How many times in history did geography, mountains, rivers, glaciers, tides, cold, heat decide the outcome before a single shot was fired? Siachen is the purest answer to that question that exists anywhere on Earth today, because the glacier hasn't just shaped the tactics of this conflict. The glacier is the conflict. The glacier is the commander-in-chief. It decides who moves, when, how far, at what cost, in which direction, and for how long. It decides who dies. Nuclear weapons don't help you on Siachen. Advanced fighter jets can barely operate at that altitude. Engine performance drops sharply in thin air, and the violent, unpredictable winds make precision strikes extraordinarily difficult. Missiles require targeting data that is nearly impossible to gather on a moving glacier that shifts meters every year. Artillery shells lose velocity in extreme cold. Tanks cannot reach the battle zone. Armored vehicles cannot approach the posts. Drones struggle to stay aloft in the thin air and constant storms. Two of the most powerful militaries in Asia, armed with nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, modern fighter aircraft, and combined armies of over 2 million soldiers, face each other on a glacier. And the glacier has made almost every one of those weapons irrelevant. The mountain doesn't care who has the bigger army. The mountain has one question for every soldier who arrives: can you breathe? 40 years. Over $100 billion. Thousands of lives. Two nations pointing nuclear warheads at each other across a frozen desert at 20,000 feet. And up there, the Siachen Glacier moves a few centimeters forward every day, the way it has for 10,000 years. Long before India and Pakistan existed. Long before anyone thought to draw a line on a map and argue about where it ended. Long before General General Hoon's phone rang in the darkness, and a young soldier's boots crunched into the snow at the top of the world. The glacier was here before the armies. The glacier will be here after. If this video changed how you think about geography and war, share it with someone who still believes battles are won by the side with better weapons. Next week on FUBAR WARS, 400 Finnish soldiers in a frozen forest at -40 degrees, 9,000 Soviet troops, one road, one night, and the most devastatingly efficient ambush in the history of winter warfare. I'll see you there.